Ever since humanity was invented all the way back in the year zero, mankind has seen all sorts of friendly rivalries over the years, such as his feud with The Rock, Terry Funk, and who can forget all the classic Al Snow jokes. As fun as all that may be, though, one friendly rivalry that trumps all of McFoley's and has nothing to do with him is the never-ending war that I made up for the sake of this video between the Shin Megami Tensei and Persona franchises. So to settle the score once and for all, you're gonna have to sit through my fat ass pitting the two best games from each respective franchise against each other, so without further ado, let me give you a crash course on just what these games even are to begin with. All the way back in 1987, a Japanese bloke by the name of Aya Nishitani wrote a trilogy of books called Digital Devil Story that were about a programmer who accidentally summoned Lucifer through his demon summoning program, and he had to stop him with his friends. Meanwhile, in real life, a few employees of the newly formed video game company Atlus loved these stories so much they adapted them into their very first video game called Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, where you'd explore dungeons and recruit demons into your party through negotiations and fuse them with each other to get better demons, which was actually pretty groundbreaking for the time. It wasn't too long before Atlus decided to make a sequel that wasn't related to the source material, but they eventually decided to just reboot the concept under the name Shin Megami Tensei so they could claim it as a dependent come tax season, although they didn't shy away from crediting Nishitani for the inspiration. None of these games ever stepped foot outside of Japan, probably due to the fact that they had more religious references crammed into them than my middle school, but they were still a big enough hit within the country to warrant spin-offs like Shin Megami Tensei If that mixed the dilemmas of teenage life with the whole demon summoning malarkey. Then Atlus loved the idea of high schoolers fighting demons so much that they decided to dive deeper into it on the PlayStation 1 with Revelations Persona that actually managed to get an international release thanks to Sony having a set of grapefruits big enough to take the risk of having to fight all the priests and nuns in the country, including Sister Magdalene. She was a feisty one. At this point, RPGs still weren't nearly as big of a deal in the West as they were in Japan, but still popular enough for the first Persona game to be a big enough hit to warrant the sequel being localized as well, plus the mainline series finally crossing the ocean with Shin Megami Tensei 3 on the PS2. However, once it was time for the third Persona game, the franchise went in a bold new direction by implementing life simulation mechanics such as balancing relationships, going to school, and also honing various life skills that all somehow help you fight demons. Like, the game was still a dungeon crawler with all the demon summoning and fusion hoopla that the Shin Megami Tensei series was known for, but it was still such a drastic change that Atlus had eventually dropped Shin Megami Tensei from the title altogether when they made Persona 4 Golden on the Vita. The first two Persona games were different from the original Shin Megami Tensei series, but still close enough to where they'd be compatible for breeding, kinda like tigers and lions, but Shin Megami Tensei 4 and Persona 4 standing next to each other is basically the same thing as a modern human standing next to a chimp. They may share a common ancestor and have vaguely similar bodies, but they're clearly not the same thing at all. Now, I'm not trying to drive any religious viewers away with a comparison to Evolution, but if you're still here listening to me talk about a franchise where you could literally whoop God's ass in a fight, then I'm kinda banking on you sticking around. Despite the Persona series drifting so far apart from the straightforward dungeon crawling approach, though, both franchises were getting more and more popular, with Persona 5 in particular skyrocketing the Persona franchise into the stratosphere, in my opinion thanks to the help of the internet communities and YouTubers in particular raising awareness to some of the more casual gamers. Hardcore fans will argue all day about which Persona game's the best, but while I could understand preferring the stories of 3 and 4, I personally find 5 Royal in particular to be the all-around best and most finely tuned Persona experience, or, you know, at least with the formula that was introduced in the third game anyway. In fact, at the risk of angering 2/3 of the Persona fan base, I'd even go as far as to say that 5 Royal perfected the life simulation formula. Naturally, when Shin Megami Tensei 5 was announced, I was raring to go, cause after all, 5 was the magic number for the Persona franchise, and really with the new formula starting with 3, it was technically the third game that really figured things out. Plus, while these two franchises are different, they're still pretty similar, seeing as one is a spin-off of the other after all, so everything that Atlus learned about how to make JRPGs fun while working on all these Persona games, on top of the decades of making all the other Mega 10 games, it certainly helped with the 5th mainline game. With expectations this high, it was mandatory that Atlus hit a home run with all these new eyeballs Persona 5's success had surely bring to the newest Shin Megami Tensei game, which probably explains why they spent 47 years working on it. That's right, 47 years, look it up. After all this waiting and 85 hours of gameplay, though, I can confidently say that Atlus absolutely hit a homer with Shin Megami Tensei 5. I haven't played 4 or 4 Apocalypse on the 3DS, despite the fact that I've literally owned them for years. I'm not about to sell this now. You see how much these things are going for on eBay? I'm gonna put my kids through proctology school with this. However, despite the fact that I haven't played them, I did put a decent amount of time into the first and third games in a failed attempt to play the entire Shin Megami Tensei series in preparation for the 5th game. While I did genuinely enjoy the time with them, I've gotta say that I could not put the 5th game down once I started it. In fact, I got so little done in my life during these 85 hours that my kids are still waiting for me to pick them up from T-ball practice. Guess now that I don't have kids anymore, I can use the money from Shin Megami Tensei 4 to buy Ether or something. Don't get me wrong though, I really do genuinely enjoy continuing my playthroughs of 1 and 3 Nocturne after finishing the 5th game, but they just didn't hook me in the same way as 5 did, so based on what I have played of the older games, I kinda think that Shin Megami Tensei 5 perfected its respective formula in the same way that 5 Royal did. I do think there's a realistic chance that I might like Shin Megami Tensei 4 or Apocalypse better after I inevitably play them, but I am skeptical that I'd like them significantly better, and I'm pretty sure that I wouldn't like the second game most, but regardless, I still feel confident in saying that Megaten 5 is the best game to pit up against Persona 5. I know there's probably a fair share of longtime Megaten fans who are fuming over me saying that, but what do you want me to say? I just so happen to think that Persona 5 Royal and Shin Megami Tensei 5 are the best games in their respective franchises. Now, does that make me a normie casual fan? Well, maybe, but if I am, then I'm a hardcore casual fan, goddammit.
As I say, I'm not a fanatic, but I'm not a casual observer either.
So seeing as I think these two games are the star quarterbacks of their teams, the real question at hand, though, is which one do I think's the almighty champion of justice or whatever? Well, given how different they are, it really comes down to a matter of preference, and if you put a gun up my ass and made me choose which game I like an ass hair more, then I suppose I'd have to break things down into 6 categories, with our special guest tiebreaker helping us out if the score comes down to 3 and 3. So let's start things off in the first category, diving right into the gameplay. The battle systems. The core mechanics of both Shin Megami Tensei and Persona 5 boil down to the turn-based battles, with 2 systems that both feel pretty similar to each other. However, there are some key differences. In Persona 5, your party consists of characters you meet throughout the game who all control their own personas, which are basically ghost-like shadows that are drawn out from the users, much like Stan's in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which came up with the idea first, FYI. Each party member controls one unique persona, but the main character Joker's got the wildcard ability, which allows him to possess multiple personas, and while he can only use one at any given time, there's 192 different ones you can acquire by negotiating with the shadows you fight against, and by fusing them together with like a billion different combinations. Using personas requires spirit points though, and once you run out of SP, you'll either have to rely on your physical attacks, which are relatively weak, or guns that are typically stronger but are only reloaded after every battle. While the other characters in the party may only have access to one persona though, they all have their own unique weapons and guns, plus tons of different combinations for team-based showtime attacks, along with various other benefits, depending on how close your bond with that character is. And if you manage to knock every enemy down, whether it be through critical hits or by hitting them with an attack they're weak against, you get the chance to use an all-out attack that does an assload of damage to the opposing party, followed by a badass pose, and these usually win most regular battles. There's a few more nuances than that, but that's pretty much the gist of it, and overall, I think it's a great spin that stays fun even after doing it for hundreds of hours in battles. Rather than summoning personas out of your ass though, Shin Megami Tensei 5's got your party members doing all the legwork themselves. First, there's the main character, the Nahobino, who can use standard attacks as well as magic, but rather than borrowing spells from personas, he's actually using it himself by taking them from demons' essences. One of the biggest differences from Persona 5's battle system, though, is that instead of battling alongside the other main characters in the game, your entire party's always made up of other demons you also gain through negotiations and fusions and all that. I mean, it's pretty much Pokemon before Pokemon, except, you know, a lot more raunchy, badass, and, well, visually appealing, of course. Personally, I think this makes the battle system a little bit more interesting than Persona 5. Like, yeah, battling alongside likable human characters with actual stories and dialogue's cool and all that, but only having 8 other party members at best to choose from just isn't nearly as interesting as far as battling is concerned. It does help that Joker could switch out between different personas, but I just think that it's a lot more fun to carefully assemble your party, sometimes even just for one specific fight, and I really love it when certain demons have special attacks that only they could use. And I already said this, but my god, these demons just look so friggin' cool, and it makes it way cooler that they're based on real-life folklore most of the time. Hell, sometimes I keep demons in my party just because they're badass looking, and even beyond the party members, I love how you upgrade your battle abilities by spending glory points that you find hidden through various glory holes scattered throughout the land, which, according to the clerk at Circuit City who sold me this game, is also based on real life, much like the demons. Making your party stronger in Persona 5 through bonding is still fun too, but you don't really choose the advantages you get, whereas Megaten 5 has you carefully considering what upgrades you really need the most at any given moment, and honestly, I kinda like that the game doesn't have you constantly buying and selling new equipment after every milestone. The weapons and armor you use in the beginning stay the same for the entire game, and not that I ever complain about buying and selling equipment in other RPGs, but in this particular game, I just think this works way better. And I know the personas you can switch out between are mostly the same demons you find in Shin Megami Tensei anyway, but it's not nearly as cool as seeing how badass your party looks in Shin Megami Tensei. One thing I think Persona 5 does do better though as far as battles are concerned is when you automatically kill weaker enemies that you strike first to avoid battles where it'd pretty much be impossible for you to lose if you tried. But even so, you still have the option to avoid weaker enemies in Shin Megami Tensei 5 if you don't feel like battling. So as far as Persona 5's battling's concerned, Shin Megami Tensei 5 wipes its ass in just about every conceivable way. Shin Megami Tensei 5 1, Persona 5 0. The next category is all the gameplay outside of the battling that makes up the rest of the experience, and I don't know about you, but I think gameplay is a pretty important thing to talk about when it comes to judging video games. After all, it's the only thing that keeps Waterworld on the Philips VCR from being a better game than Super Mario Odyssey.
And this is just one long cutscene, and then the game's just over. Of course Mario Odyssey's better, aside from the Virtual Boy version, of course, minus the graphics and watered-down story. Yes, pun intended, seeing as how I did write this out beforehand. Come to think of it, this reminds me of Air Bud on the same console. I don't think I like the VCR very much.
Whenever you're not fighting shadows in the metaverse, though, Persona 5's got you living a somewhat ordinary high school life in Tokyo in between all your Phantom Thief operations. This includes going to school, working a part-time job, working out, renting movies, watching movies, and tons of other stuff, most of which involves you hanging out with your friends and even banging some of them, or in the case of the adult characters like your teacher, being diddled by them. Strengthening your bonds and honing your life skills will ultimately make you more formidable in the metaverse, but since you can only do so much in a day, you gotta spend your time wisely and avoid being rude to your confidants if you want to max everything out by the end of the game. I can totally see how this wouldn't be everyone's cup of tea, but for whatever reason, I find this gameplay so goddamn addictive. Like, I always keep telling myself one more day until the entire month's up, but then I realize it's like 6 AM in the real world. Then on the other side of the coin, though, we've got Shin Megami Tensei 5 with a much more straightforward approach that's every bit as good. The gist here is that you're pretty much left to your own devices in one of 4 hefty-sized areas with an overwhelming amount of stuff to do, most of which centers around collecting things and side quests. Sometimes the side quests just have you go kill something, which, don't get me wrong, is still pretty fun, but other times there's a little more meat on the bones, and every now and then you gotta choose which side you want to help, with there never really being a right or wrong answer, which I much prefer over the game punishing you for thinking one demon was being a little bit of a bigger wiener than the other. And no, I'm not talking about this thing when I say wiener. Get your mind out of the gutter, come on, this is a family channel here. But anyway, Shin Megami Tensei 5 is a game that got me hooked pretty goddamn quick, because every part of these maps just has so much fun stuff squeezed into every square inch, and the game rewards you just often enough to make you want to keep playing. Much like Persona 5, you always tell yourself you're gonna go to bed right after you find 2 more Memon so you can get enough glory for an upgrade, but then once you get that upgrade, you decide you might as well go out and find 1 more Memon to get a reward from the shop. And then once you're out looking for that last Memon, you'll find a glory crystal, and after getting that reward, you see that you only need 10 more glory to get that other upgrade you neglected earlier now that you found that glory crystal out in the wild. So what do? Well, you go out and find a couple more Memon to get a little extra glory, go back and get that miracle upgrade you neglected earlier, and then you find out you only need a few more Memon to get the next reward from the shop, so you go back out there and die in a random battle and shout obscenities at your TV.
Poop.
Both games are extremely fun for entirely different reasons, and for the average person, I'd say the open-world RPG mechanics are probably more fun to the average gamer as opposed to the life simulator aspects of Persona 5, but if you ask me, well, I actually agree. Shin Megami Tensei 5 is way better. It's not that I think the open world method's superior to the life simulator aspect or anything like that, but I don't know. I just think that Megaten 5 does a better job at keeping the game fun at all times. Like, I know there's tons of dungeon crawling aspects to Mementos, and I love exploring the palaces more than the dungeons in Megaten 5, but I mean, in Persona 5, you do kind of sit through over an hour of cutscenes before you actually truly experience any gameplay. Don't get me wrong, Megaten 5 definitely has some long-ass cutscenes too, but once they're over, you got a few dozen hours of gameplay, whereas in Persona 5, on the other hand, is constantly throwing you TV show episode-length cutscenes after every milestone. I have no problem with that whatsoever, since I'm always enjoying the experience, but since Shin Megami Tensei 5's focused way more on gameplay, then I just don't see how you can't give it the point here. Plus, I really just do find it more enjoyable anyway. Shin Megami Tensei 5 2, Persona 5 0. The story. Seeing how Persona 5's got way more cutscenes, you'd think that I'd just automatically give it the point, but just because one story is longer does not mean that it's necessarily better. I mean, after all, I love the short-lived Wonder Shows and way more than I love the entire Fast and the Furious franchise.
You don't ever see me ripping material off from Vin Diesel, do you?
I don't want to spoil too much from either story or ramble on and on about details, but Persona 5 is basically about a group of teenagers who call themselves the Phantom Thieves, and they've got the ability to go into an alternate dimension known as the Metaverse using an app on their cell phones. Everyone's got what's known as a shadow in this alternate dimension that shows a person's true nature, and if their desires are distorted and strong enough, they'll form a palace, which is basically just a dungeon. Inside each of these palaces are treasures that represent the person's desires, and if the Phantom Thieves steal these treasures using the powers of their personas that can't be used in the ordinary world, then the palace ruler will have a change of heart. So basically, the idea is that they try to make the world a better place by changing the hearts of everyone who's making the world a worse place. There's way more to it than that with well over 60 hours of dialogue, but that's pretty much the crash course of what's going on here. Meanwhile, in Shin Megami Tensei 5, though, you play as an ordinary high schooler who gets caught up in an earthquake and transported into an alternate dimension's Tokyo, much like in Persona 5. However, once in this world, you get attacked by demons until a kinda sorta god fuses with you, causing you to become what's known as the Forbidden Nahobino. That's pretty much a deity. First you try to get back to Tokyo, then you get caught up into a war between angels and demons, but if I say much more than that, then I'll get into spoiler/rambling territory. Mega Ten 5 goes for the less is more approach, while Persona 5 goes for the more is more approach, but ultimately, these are two very different stories that go for very different things. You can easily make the argument that since we're talking about video games, the minimal story is actually the better story, but in my opinion, I just prefer the story I'm entertained by the most when I set the controller down. What sets a lot of video games apart from movies, though, especially these two, is the ability to make choices that directly affect the outcome of the story itself, but as much as I appreciate Shin Megami Tensei 5 for being deep and easy to follow, I've gotta say that Persona 5 just does a little bit more for me. It's not necessarily that I prefer more relatable games. In fact, usually it's the opposite, but I don't know. I guess I just like the variety to serious dialogue, wacky lighthearted banter, and just weird shit in general. I do much prefer Shin Megami Tensei 5's method of having multiple endings where really none of them are the bad ending, though. I mean, after playing a game for 100 hours, the last thing I want is to choose what I think's the lesser of two evils, only for the game to say, haha, you made the wrong choice 10 hours ago, so you get the bad ending. Guess you gotta put another 100 hours in if you want to see the super ultra true for real we mean it this time ending. The reason why this doesn't really bother me with Persona 5, though, is because it's pretty obvious what the best choices are, as long as you're not a turd anyway. As long as you get the true ending, I just feel way more satisfied with Persona 5's ending than any of the possible endings in Mega Ten 5. And even beyond just the endings, I love how Persona 5's got tons of different things that could happen in the middle of the game based on your choices. Like, the main story doesn't really change till the end, but there's just way more you could experience with all the secondary stories, mainly dependent on how many of the girls you choose to wrestle with in the bedroom, especially on Valentine's Day. And hell, even when you're just playing the freaking game, the characters are constantly saying all kinds of fun stuff, particularly in Mementos. I haven't witnessed every possible line of dialogue in Persona 5, but I've enjoyed pretty much everything that I have heard, and never found myself to be bored or irritated off the top of my head. I wouldn't argue with anyone who prefers the story of Shin Megami Tensei 5, but to me, Persona 5 just does a little bit more, especially in Royal where they added a lot more meat and potatoes. Shin Megami Tensei 5 2, Persona 5 Royal 1. Next up is the graphics category, which is definitely the least important one, but that doesn't mean it's not important at all. It might be a lot more cut and dry than the other categories, but there is still a decent bit to unpack here. You see, Persona 5 Royal may be a PS4 game, so you'd think that it'd just blow the Switch exclusive out of the water, but the original Persona 5 was made for the PS3, and even though I'm sure to get it in the comments for saying this, I don't really think Royal looks any different at all visually. In fact, I'd even say the game looks pretty much the same as Persona 5 Strikers, which also runs on the Switch, albeit with longer load times and frame rate issues. But my point is that just because Persona 5 Royal's platform's got more power doesn't make this an unfair round, because both titles really go more for style than trying to trick your brain into thinking it's looking at something real. And I mean, for a Switch game, Shin Megami Tensei 5 looks pretty cool, and even though it might not be as colorful as Persona 5, the darker visuals really do a great job at making you feel like you're in a post-apocalyptic world infested with demons, but even so, it's still pretty gross to see demons moving at 4 frames per year if they're more than like 50 yards away. Now, does this affect the actual game itself outside of making you flaccid? Of course not. If you ported this to the PlayStation 7 in the future, the core game would still be the exact same thing, as opposed to comparing PS2 games that were also on the PS1. But still though, if we're making comparisons, it does kind of give Persona 5 an edge. But don't hang your head in shame just yet though, Mega Ten 5, because I'm not going to let the fate of this point come down to something as arbitrary as a few stuttering demons that are too far to interact with anyway. No, I'm afraid that even beyond that, Persona 5 just looks way too goddamn cool to not awarded the point here, because to me, graphics aren't all about power, but really just what's nice to look at the end of the day. I mean, what would you honestly rather look at, Yoshi's Island on the Super Nintendo or Siphon Filter on the more advanced PS1? Shin Megami Tensei 5 2, Persona 5 Royal 2. The music. Persona 5 Royal has probably got my all-time favorite video game soundtrack in the history of, well, everything, really. In fact, I'm not even ashamed to admit that I choose to listen to this soundtrack from time to time of my own free will, and I even use songs from this for my skateboarding edits fairly often. However, despite how much personal love I have for the soundtrack, that does not mean that it's getting the point automatically, because the purpose of video game music isn't necessarily to sound good, it's more so to immerse you into the world of the game you're playing, and Shin Megami Tensei 5 completely nails this with its soundtrack. When I was like 30 minutes into this game, I was admittedly a little disappointed in the battle music not being nearly as good of a standalone song as Last Surprise or Takeover. However, it didn't take me very long to realize that this type of music is just perfect for this kind of game where you're kind of supposed to feel like you're doomed even if you win. And the whole world you're in just plain sucks, but in a good way that you can't experience in many other games. I mean, one of my biggest complaints with Breath of the Wild is that the overworld lacking the iconic Zelda music disappointed me, and every time I say that, I'm reminded that you're in the overworld for the entire game, so any music you're gonna hear is gonna get old after like 5 minutes. But Shin Megami Tensei 5 gives you 4 different overworlds, each with their own theme song, and none of those ever get old, so I don't want to hear it. They're not songs I'd ever craved to listen to on my way to the gyno or anything like that, but they always do their job at making me feel a little bit bummed out while also having me intrigued to keep on pushing.
We gonna keep on pushing for life, you know what I'm saying?
It's not to say that good music can't also immerse you into a game, though, because Persona 5 does manage to do both, so I guess you could say that it deserves some kind of bonus points for that. But to me, that's not really fair, because it's like, As I Cried Naked is the greatest band of the past 74 years. Everybody could agree on that. But if you put their songs in Donkey Kong Country 2, it wouldn't have made the game nearly as good as Grant Kirkhope's soundtrack did. I'm gonna have to make a controversial call and go with a draw on this one, so sorry, tiebreaker, I don't think we're gonna need you after all. Due to these unforeseen circumstances that were totally foreseen seeing as I wrote this video out beforehand, it looks like all the marbles are going to be decided by which games got the better overall replayability. As I touched on a little bit earlier, Persona 5 Royal goes down a pretty linear path for the main story until around the last 4th or even 8th of the game, but there's still plenty of different ways you can take all the side stories that are all highly entertaining. And seeing as how there's only really one great definitive ending, you might not be as motivated to see where the other relationship paths take you, or what happens when you're invited to certain activities with multiple people on specific Sundays. Seeing as how Shin Megami Tensei 5 doesn't really have a bad ending that'll make you feel like you wasted your time though, you might want to see what could have been with all the other endings. However, in my opinion, that's really the only other thing you'll want to see on a second playthrough, though. You see, on my first playthrough, I refused to fight the final boss till I felt like I'd done everything there was to do, and luckily I made all the right choices to get the hidden route as an option for when the choices really mattered. And then once I got the ending, I decided to start a new game plus with all my stats carried over, just to see how quickly I could get through the first area if I skipped through all the cutscenes and headed straight for all the main quests, and before I knew it, I was at the very end of the game before the final boss within 10 hours. And even that's with a decent amount of dilly-dallying, despite the fact that I told myself I wouldn't collect any Memon or do any of the side quests. But I just couldn't resist grabbing what was right in front of me to max out all my miracles and to see all the alternative choices with the side quests that had choices. Sadly though, there wasn't really anything that I thought made the game worth playing through again, and I was beating most of the bosses and punishing foes in like 1 to 2 turns, and I know that I'm a jabroni for carrying my stats over, but come on, I love grinding on RPGs, but I'm not gonna do it twice when I have stacks of other games that I haven't even opened yet, some of which are $40 cheaper than when I bought them. I know you might think I'm the worst person in the world for saying this, but I'm not gonna start a game over with my character at level 1 in a mode where I'm gonna have to grind even more than I did last time. The weirdest thing about making it to the end of the game in 10 hours is I just kinda stopped caring after I beat the optional boss Shiva right before the final boss. My first playthrough was an absolute blast, and honestly one of my all-time favorite video games, no questions asked, but I don't know, I just didn't care to see all the other endings. I could see them all real easy if I wanted to since my save file's at the very end of the game, but I don't know. I don't really feel like I'll get the extra satisfaction than I would from watching them on YouTube, and as of this moment, I haven't even seen any of the other endings other than the one I got. With Persona 5, on the other hand, though, it didn't really matter whether or not I carried my stats over, because there was just so much more sprinkled throughout the game from beginning to end that I could get something out of the New Game Plus, and with Royal in particular, I could even complete some of the challenges for the Thieves' Den. They're both phenomenal games, but at the end of the day, Persona 5 Royal wins by an ass hair 3-2. At least in my opinion, anyway.
Alright, so I know that Atlus connoisseurs are probably going to leave an upper decker in the comments over this due to the idea that Shin Megami Tensei is the game for the true hardcore fans, whereas Persona is really more meant for the normie, casual weebs or whatever, and that's fine, but I mean, this is my video and opinion, so I'm not gonna lie just so we can hang out, you know? Well, Shin Megami Tensei 5 does better than Persona 5 Royal. It does way better, but it just doesn't offer as much variety and, in my opinion, replayability. If you're only looking for a solid turn-based JRPG, then Mega Ten 5 is the best of the best of the best, sir, like that guy from Men in Black 1 said.
The best of the best of the best, sir.
But if you're looking for a unique turn-based JRPG with an experience that you can't get anywhere else, then Persona 5 Royal is definitely the way to go. It just depends on whether or not what's unique about that game is something that's up your alley. I'm not saying that Shin Megami Tensei can't be better than Persona, I just think that this one particular Persona game is a wee bit better than this one particular Shin Megami Tensei game is all. You know what, if that makes me a bad person, then go ahead and call the Wambulance.
A few moments later.
I can't believe you actually did it. And are you even a licensed proctologist?